Ethics Untangled is brought to you by IDEA, the Ethics Centre at the University of Leeds. To find out more about IDEA, go to ahc.leeds.ac.uk/ethics. Adam Byfield is Principal Technical Assurance Specialist in the NHS. He was a great guest on the podcast previously back in November 2024, when he was talking in a general way about providing ethical assurance for AI applications in healthcare. And we were really keen to get him back to dive into some more specific issues. We chose bias and accessibility, two related issues that are clearly central for anyone concerned with AI, including in healthcare applications. We talked about different forms of bias, how bias can affect accessibility, and what forms of bias, if any, might be acceptable. Welcome to the podcast again, Adam.
Thanks, great to be here. Cheers, Jim.
Great. So we had you on before and it was a really excellent episode. I had really good comments actually from a lot of listeners about your episode. So we're really keen to get you back on. And last time we were just talking about assuring AI systems in the NHS generally, right? So we were kind of asking, what sort of issues are you looking for? What kind of process do you adopt when you're assuring AI systems, and how does it work? And what kind of assurance are you trying to offer to the public? I think that was an interesting question there as well. And today we thought we'd zoom in on a couple of related ethical concepts and talk about how those play into assuring AI systems. And the two concepts we're going to talk about are accessibility and bias. So I wondered if you could, first of all, tell me what you mean by accessibility and bias, and also why are we talking about these two concepts together, right? Because some people might think of these as, both interesting ethical concepts, but not necessarily related to each other, but they are related to each other. So it'd be good to talk about that.
Absolutely. Yeah. Thanks, Jim. So I think in the context that we're talking about here, this is very specifically about technology and the technology that I work with. So in that context, think if we start by talking about accessibility. So obviously we can think of that as just how easy is it for somebody to access the technology. And I think you can think of that as there are two aspects to that. I think there's the aspects of, can you access it at all? So that might be just access to infrastructure, so an internet connection, for example, or access to equipment, so internet, an internet-enabled phone, for example. I think worth noting, it's something that I think a lot of people take for granted, an internet connection take for granted. Not everyone has that, and I think public libraries are often overlooked in that respect, as for a lot of people, the local library is the only way you can get on the internet. So that's a really key thing. But then the second part of it is also that, even if you've got that access, how easy is the technology to use? So particularly if you've got some form of disability, so if you've got some kind of sight impairment, do you need a high contrast setting or an audio description, things like that. So I think if we think of accessibility as being just how easy is it to use the technology, and then bias, I think you can think of this as being how well does the technology perform for different people? And so there can be instances where, because of the way in which the technology has been developed, it will perform better or worse for different groups of people. And if you're in the group for whom it performs worse, then that makes it harder for you to use the technology. So I'd say that bias can be an obstacle to accessibility. So that would be the interplay.
Yeah. So one of the reasons why we might worry about bias is because it's going to interfere with people's ability to access these systems. Yeah. I thought it was worth saying, by the way, that's not the only reason why we would worry about bias, right? It's not that we're saying that bias is only a problem because it leads to accessibility problems. So, I mean, I can't remember whether we mentioned this last time or it was on a different episode, but people might be familiar with the racist hand dryer case, right? So this is something that happened apparently in America. There was a hand dryer that people were installing in toilets, and it was trained through some kind of algorithmic system where it was supposed to recognize when a pair of hands were put underneath it, and it would automatically come on. And unfortunately, because the data set that it had been trained with was entirely Caucasians, right, it didn't recognize people who didn't have white hands, basically. So it's a kind of classic simple example of kind of bias in tech. But it kind of strikes me that is partly a problem of accessibility, right? Because if you haven't got the right coloured hands, you're not able to access this piece of technology. But that's not the only reason why that's a problem. It's also a problem because it's kind of insulting. So it's not just that you aren't able to access the hand dryer, you know, so it's not the same as if the hand dryer just wasn't working. It's that you're actually being excluded because of a characteristic of yours. And that's kind of a distinctive harm, I suppose.
Yeah, I suppose another way in which you could look at it as well would be, I think, I mean, we'd probably come on to this in more detail later, but I think a lot of the time those issues arise because of the people in the room making the decision. And so that is, unfortunately, that is the skin tone issue that's come up numerous times. That is sadly quite a common issue. We don't know for sure, do we? But it would seem to make sense that if there were more people of colour in the room when that product is being developed and when those things have been thought about, that would be less likely to happen. And so you could potentially also look at bias as an indicator of the structures that those systems are coming out of. So if it's biased, if the product is biased, does that actually suggest a deeper bias in the development process and the development teams?
Yeah, so there's these kind of deeper questions about justice and so on, which aren't necessarily encapsulated purely by the problem of accessibility, but accessibility is a distinctive harm that can arise from biased systems. Yeah. So thinking about accessibility then, I suppose when people think about accessibility in technology, people might think about some of the kinds of things that you've mentioned already, like screen readers, large text, kind of means of allowing people who have particular disabilities and so on to access technology. But AI raises some novel kinds of issue with accessibility, doesn't it? So what are the distinctive issues that AI raises?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think to start off with, it's worth remembering that AI is nearly always embedded in a traditional system. And so a lot of the time, the outputs, you know, they might be generated in a novel way using AI, but they're output in a normal way. So those traditional accessibility things will still cover a lot of that, will still work. But yeah, I think one example of this that I thought of was relating to large language models. So these are, so ChatGPT is probably the most famous large language model. And those are used as the basis for a lot of products now. A lot of AI products are built on top of something like that. One of the big challenges with systems like that is consistency. So because they are probability-based systems, you know, they're aiming to, every answer you get from LLM is basically a best guess. If it's performing well, then the majority of the time, that is also the right answer. But it's a big challenge we face in assuring healthcare systems is that it's very hard to guarantee that an LLM is not going to occasionally just get it wrong, hallucinate, or just come to the wrong decision. Now, for a user with no accessibility issues, that's probably inconvenient. But as long as you've spotted it, ultimately the impact is, I've got to do that again now because, you know, that was wrong. I've got to do it again. If, however, you've got particular accessibility needs that are dependent on that always being right, then when it does occasionally make an error, which by definition it is bound to, that impact is probably much greater on you. Because it might be, rather than simply getting the wrong answer, it might be, I can't access this now. You know, I've been shut out of this because it's got it wrong. So it's a lot harder with that type of technology to ensure consistency and say this will always behave like this. And therefore it's harder to guarantee accessibility.
Yeah. So those LLMs, they're not actually trying to say things that are true, are they? What they're doing kind of on a technical level is they're sort of presenting something, you know, it's, if you ask it a question, it's what does an answer to that question look like? That's the kind of answer that you're going to get. And it's not necessarily going to be actually telling you the truth. It's going to be something that looks like the truth, but that's actually even worse, isn't it?
Potentially, yeah, because if it's harder to spot potential. I mean, a lot of the big LLMs that are trained on the internet, as they say, they scrape the internet for their data. rather than giving you the right answer, they're typically giving you the most common answer. Now, a lot of the time, those are the same thing. That's fine. But occasionally they're not. And that's how you can sometimes get spurious responses, because if those spurious responses happen to be really popular, the AI can't distinguish between I'm seeing that answer loads of times because people think it's funny, or I'm seeing it because it's the right answer. So, yeah. So is that consistency issue is tricky.
Yeah, of course. And so one of the issues that you've identified is literacy bias. So could you talk about what that is, please?
Absolutely, yeah. So my team and I have done quite a lot of work on bias generally. And this is a really interesting one. So normally the kind of bias that we talk about is bias in the way in which the AI makes a decision. So it gets an input, it makes a decision, it gives an output, and typically we think of bias in that decision-making process. But literacy bias is about impacting the input bit. So actually being able to give the AI the information in the first place. So it relates specifically to chatbots and similar systems, AI search systems. And this was something that came a couple of years ago. We'd noticed that increasingly a lot of organizations are moving away from a phone line and switching to an online text-based chatbot. So that's their kind of first point of contact with the public, your kind of primary channel. And that makes sense for them in terms of being cheaper. It's in some circumstances it's arguably better because it can respond quicker, things like that. But what it does mean is that if you think of a phone line, the cohort of people who can access that is basically everyone who can make themselves understood to a person by talking. So if we think of that cohort, and then the move to chatbots, we're moving to a different cohort of people. And that is anyone who can make themselves understood in writing to an AI. And the suggestion is that second cohort is smaller, basically. So what we're effectively doing is applying this entry condition now of saying, in order to access our service, you now need to be able to communicate in writing to a certain level. And that if your literacy is below a certain level, then potentially the chatbot can't understand what you are asking and therefore can't give you the answer that you want. So we'd identified that there's the potential for a particular group of people with a particular level of literacy to effectively be excluded from that service. And so that's what we'd called that phenomenon literacy bias.
Okay. So are we talking about literacy in the sense of linguistic literacy? We're not talking about technical literacy.
That's absolutely right.
Or is that an issue as well?
No. I mean, that is also an issue. So there's an issue of technology literacy or AI literacy, which is just people's kind of understanding of the technology and their ability to use it. This is specifically the more traditional sense of your ability to read and write. That's what we're talking about.
Okay. And what are people trying to do to address that then?
So there's a couple of things. So in terms of how we're addressing it within the NHS, so my team have developed techniques by which to detect and measure literacy bias. So we share that information within the NHS. So we'd come up with techniques by which we can identify if a chatbot is demonstrating literacy bias, but also then to drill down into the exact nature of that bias. So we worked on a public-facing system that had a text interface like that, and we were able to identify that there was some literacy bias, but more than that, we were able to identify that so that particular chatbot was fine with poor spelling, it was fine with poor grammar, so even if that was a bit of a mess, it could still understand what you were saying. But what we did find was if you didn't use punctuation, it very quickly couldn't understand what you were saying to it. So we were able to identify not only there's some literacy bias, but there is this particular literacy bias. So somebody who struggles to use punctuation is also going to struggle to access that service through that chatbot.
That's really interesting. My sense is that punctuation is kind of the first thing to go, maybe sometimes. I mean, quite often you do see people just not using punctuation at all, and it is difficult to follow, but
absolutely, yeah. I mean, that's interesting as well in terms of obviously the range of inputs. So, some people are going to type into that chat box almost as if they're writing an email or a letter and be quite structured. And so other people might treat it like a text message, in which case, as you say, actually quite likely that you skip the punctuation because it's text speak, that kind of thing. What that meant though was that in the short term, it enabled that team they could issue user guidance, so they could specifically say to users, try and avoid that. It meant that they could monitor it, so they could look at the inputs they were getting and specifically look at how often do we get something that doesn't have proper punctuation. So now they know what it is, they can measure it. And that allows you to put in place kind of safety nets or alternatives. So you might have a dropout where it says, actually, this doesn't seem to be working. Do you want to just talk to a person? So you can put that in place. And then longer term, because the specific issue has been identified, then you can potentially retrain the model to be better at that particular case.
Yes, I was going to say, can you do that? Can you just give it loads of data where people aren't using punctuation? And because it strikes me, generally, it's harder to understand when somebody isn't using punctuation, but you can generally decipher it if you spend a bit of time, right? So presumably the system could do that as well if it was.
That's right. Yeah. So that's the bigger proper fix, if you like. That's the larger job. So you might do that. You might do that later. But yes, you can retrain it. To be fair, there is a limit in that you wouldn't necessarily expect the chatbot to be able to understand something that we couldn't understand. So we're not expecting it to be perfect. And it is reasonable to say, all right, you get to a point where it's acceptable that you can't understand that because I don't know what that is either. So,
yes. Yeah. And then it's really important to have those points where it drops out and gives you the option of talking to a human being. Yes. I suppose that also does raise the possibility that somebody might kind of game the system to get to talk to a human being. If they don't want the chatbot, right, then just don't use punctuation and you'll eventually...
there's an argument to say that some people would argue that should be an option anyway. That you should be able to choose whether you have to interact with it or not. I think certainly industry good practice says that at the very least it should be made clear to the person that it is a chatbot. And I have seen those in the past where I think I was using a famous food delivery app that I won't name, but we had an issue with the food didn't get delivered. And so going through talking to an agent who was helping me, address that issue. And I realized very quickly, this is not a person. This is definitely an AI, but it is being presented to me as if it is a person, which is a little cheeky, I think. But yeah. So, I think there's also, just to say, there's also, that's what we're trying to do about literacy bias. I think more generally in terms of trying to prevent it in the first place, you touched on it yourself, Jim, but it comes down to that training data. And I think generally with bias generally as well, it's also what we said at the start, that there's something about making sure that the right people are in the room in the first place. So I think, unfortunately, there are loads of instances out there that we can think of decisions that have been made by groups of very competent men that have completely neglect the obvious needs of women because there aren't any women in the room. So, a good way to address any form of bias is to actually make sure that those people are, if possible, those people are in the room. Literacy bias is a challenging one. It's going to be much more difficult for someone with literacy issues to become a technology professional.
Yeah.
But not impossible, just harder, right? They can do. But yeah, so if it's not possible to have those people actually as part of the team in the room, at the very least you need champions.
Yeah.
They need to be thought of and represented in some form. Because if it's baked in right at the beginning, we stop the problem from happening in the first place. But it's later on. Yeah.
Great. All right. Thanks. Okay. So that's literacy bias. And literacy bias, so that's an example of how AI systems might have accessibility problems in the sense that some people are just unable to access them because of their level of literacy and so on. But the other form of accessibility problem that we wanted to talk about, also related to bias, is the kind of case you get where systems work better for some people than they do for others, right? Because of bias that's kind of baked into the system at some point. So can you give any examples of that kind of issue and explain how that works?
Yeah, absolutely. So it's worth just briefly thinking about the difference between AI and non-AI and how AI works. So a non-AI system, a traditional IT system, is written by computer code. So that's effectively just a big long list of specific instructions. So we can see exactly what those instructions are, and they're just listed out there. An AI-based system, and the behavior is not driven by the code so much as the data used to train it. And so for AI, instead of a big long list of explicit instructions, what we've got is a big long list of examples, basically. So we give it when we say training data, what we're giving it is ideally minimum 100,000 examples of, this is the task I want you to perform, and this is the correct answer for that task. So you're just giving it examples of how to do the job. So, the most common example that we use as an analogy is a kind of a cat-dog identifier. So if I show it a picture of a cat or a dog, it can recognize what it is. And you would train that by giving it tens, if not hundreds of thousands of pictures of dogs, telling it this is a dog, and of cats, telling it this is a cat. And what it's going to look for, it's going to turn those pictures into very long numbers, and then it is going to look for patterns in those numbers. So it's going to go, okay, every time you're telling me this is a cat, I often see these patterns, and the same for a dog. So it's just building up these correlations. And basically, the more examples you give it, the better it will be at doing that. And so in that instance, if we had two classes like cat and dog, we want it to be equally good at identifying both. So we need to give it a similar number of examples. So bias can come in when we don't have a similar number of examples. So if I give it 100,000 pictures of a dog and I give it 10 pictures of a cat, it is not going to be as good at recognizing cats because it just I haven't given it the experience it needs to do that. So if we shift into thinking about people and perhaps patient data, things like that, about real people, we can start to think of that in terms of how many of this type of person have I shown it, and how many of that type of person have I shown it? And so, the hand dryer example that you cited earlier is a really good one. But, if I show this hundreds of thousands of pictures of white skin, and only very few pictures of brown skin, it's just not going to be as good at identifying brown skin. So it's in that sense, it is as simple as that. And yeah, I think so. What it really comes down to is it's that training data. It's where you source it from, what's in it, and how are those different classes balanced, basically.
Yeah. In healthcare systems, though, is that sometimes working in that it's not that it, like with the hand dryer, it just didn't work when somebody with brown skin put their hands underneath it. But it strikes me that with healthcare systems, it might be that it seems to work in the same way, but because it isn't as well trained with those people, it will give less accurate results. Is that the kind of thing that might happen?
I mean, potentially, yeah. I mean, I think it's important to note that healthcare AI is distinct from most other AI because the stakes are so much higher. So the quality bar is higher. I'm not aware of any AI system that's doing anything clinical on its own. So yeah, so anything even vaguely clinical currently, a human clinician has the final say. But yeah, so yes, so that bias absolutely could exist. We have safety nets in place to catch it, but yeah, we absolutely want to reduce that bias being there in the first place. Yeah, definitely. And as I say, it comes from those data sets. It's what is the data you are using to train it in the first place.
Yes. Okay. Great. If the issue is about the data that the systems are being trained with, presumably the answer then is to train it with more representative data sets, is it, or something like that?
Exactly that. Yeah. So it's, to be fair, sourcing training data is really hard. So you need large volumes of data in the first place, and you want it to be rich. You want it to contain all the stuff that you need, and you want it to be good quality. That's harder than you might think to find, because who's holding that in the first place? Who's captured it in the first place? Does it exist? And then depending on who's holding it, there's often going to be a cost attached to it. I mean, one of the things with the NHS from an AI point of view that puts us in a quite strong position is we hold lots of data ourselves. So we've already got a lot of that data. But yeah, if you're a small startup or another company, you're probably going to have to buy that data, and it's not necessarily NHS data, but the data you need generally, you're probably going to have to purchase that from somebody, and that is potentially expensive. A lot of the time, if it's real world data, it won't be balanced because the world isn't balanced, right? We don't have the exact same number of every demographic category, so the live data that you get in its raw form isn't going to be balanced. So really, good practice would say that you should be augmenting that data to balance it.
Right.
So that might mean generating some synthetic data to kind of pad out the underrepresented categories, things like that. So there's a whole curation step that should be taking place to avoid bias. Yeah.
Not wanting to kind of go off on a tangent, but I'm always interested in this idea of synthetic data. So the idea is that you will construct some data, which you'll then, so it's not real people, it's not data about real people, it's data that you've constructed in order to what? Like how do you do that? Because how are you not just replicating the biases that are already in your data?
It is tricky. So there is a move currently towards using synthetic data for training, and this is primarily to get around that issue of trying to find and having to pay for data. So you can see the industry's kind of gone, that's a slow and expensive step. What can we do differently? So synthetic data, in principle, we can generate that ourselves. So, that's a better solution. There are limitations to that, though. As you say, there are restrictions to that. So you could create synthetic data from scratch. So you could say, well, these are my fields. I've got age, gender, height, weight. These are the ranges for those fields. So I can just start generating those from scratch. Typically, though, as you say, because you want those that real world value.
Well, yeah, I mean, what's the point of having data if it's not about the real world?
Yeah.
Like, how is it training?
So quite often you might, rather than start from scratch, you might augment real data. So you might take a copy of a real person and then change them a bit so that it's based on real data, but is a bit different. The big limitation of it is when the AI is doing that training and looking for those correlations, we don't know what those are. We can't see what those correlations are. So we can often have a good guess, and it's often very tempting to assume what the correlation is. But it's entirely feasible that the AI spotted something that we would never think of. It's found some other correlation that works, So creating the synthetic data does have that danger of we might be unwittingly missing out the thing that it needs, and we don't know. So the benefit is, as I say, you can do it yourself, so it's faster and cheaper, and you can crack on with it. And to be fair, if you've got a very specific use case, you might be clearer on what it needs. If it's quite a narrow channel, then it's only looking at these things. Maybe that's easier. But if it's something very general, and you try to replicate a big population in lots of different ways, there will be limitations to that. So it's a trade-off. Yeah.
Great. Okay. So presumably the people who are aware that there might be accessibility or bias issues in technology, or kind of who might be the first people to become aware of that, are people who are using those systems. So I was wondering, do they have any control over the way the systems are trained, or can they kind of communicate to the technicians, that there's an issue here and that something needs to be done?
So I think the short answer to that from a user point of view is probably no. It does. There is a very broad range of types of AI, and there are certainly some AI systems that are what we call open source. So that means you can go and look, they're quite happy for you to go and look at their code and possibly even their training data. But actually, the vast majority of commercial systems, if you're buying or using a finished product that is a commercial system, the training data is probably going to be part of their intellectual property in some way. And so they're not going to share that. Similarly with the LLMs that we were talking about earlier, if you've got a large language model that has been trained on the whole of the internet, as they often claim, even if you could look at the training data, that's so vast. What are you going to do with it? So no, from a user point of view, it would be relatively rare that you're going to be able to go and access the training data and look at it. And to be honest, if we're getting to the point of identifying issues, if the user is identifying defects after the product's finished and released, I mean, I would say this, wouldn't I? But from my point of view, I'd say that's because we should have picked that up during development, right? So retraining is potentially a significant undertaking, right? Particularly if it's quite a fundamental thing. So yeah, I mean, if you've got to the point of you've finished it and released it, and then a huge issue is identified, the idea that you're going to then pull your product and completely retrain it, that's quite a big deal, right? That's going to cost you money. So really, these things do need to be caught. If these things are caught during development, it's going to be a lot quicker and easier to fix them. So really, the user shouldn't have to. But no, in terms of users having any influence over training data, I don't think we really do.
No, fair enough. Yeah. Okay. Whose responsibility is it then to reduce bias and optimize accessibility?
Yeah, so this is a really good question actually, and it's quite a broad issue in testing assurance generally, really. So there's one school of thought, which is that everyone is responsible for quality. Now, I'll be honest, I kind of hate that personally. I really don't like it, but to be fair, it does make a couple of good points. So it's certainly true that you want everyone involved in the project. Bearing in mind that, technology projects can be huge with hundreds of people working on them. Certainly true, you want everyone to be thinking about quality. You want everyone to care about quality so that everyone's looking for issues and working to solve them. So in that kind of work culture sense, that's true. You could also say that everyone in the supply chain potentially can contribute to quality. So if you're looking at procuring products, you might challenge and say, well, what are you doing about bias? And if I'm not happy with what you're doing about bias, I'm not going to buy the product. So yeah. So there's an argument to say that everybody involved can contribute towards quality. But the reason I don't like that is because I feel like if everybody's responsible, then nobody is accountable.
Yes. So I was going to say, perhaps what we need to do here is distinguish between responsibility and accountability, right? Because responsibility is actually quite a vague word, or at least it is used in lots of different ways, right?
Absolutely.
So maybe what we want to say is everybody's responsible in the sense that you can't abdicate responsibility and say it's up to somebody else to do this. Everybody needs to be paying attention to these issues and trying to get something done about it. But we want to have very specific named people who are accountable in the sense that they are held to account if something goes wrong.
Yeah. Right. And so, working in assurance, that is what we spend a lot of our time thinking about, of what happens if this goes wrong. And so you could extend that, say, if that did go wrong, who would ultimately be accountable for it, So I think, the reason this becomes tricky then is because, as I say, I think technology projects are often very large and very complicated with lots and lots of people involved. It is not really feasible to have a single person who can be across all the detail of every single moving part and therefore make all the decisions. Even if you could, that would be such a bottleneck. I mean, it would just take decades to get anything done. So what we have to rely on then are processes rather than people. And I think this is where we fall down. I think this is often this is how bias can creep into systems like this. But it's also just generally, I think, how even outside of technology, I think, the number of national scandals that we see where there's some kind of review and start pointing out, there are opportunities to address this and stuff. And I think when those things happen, so say we've released a product and then it's found to be biased, for example, I think the kind of human instinct on that is that we're looking for one of two types of villain, right? So we're either looking for a lazy person or a bad person. So we're going, there must be somebody somewhere who either couldn't be bothered to do the job, or there's somebody somewhere who's maliciously done it wrong on purpose. And a lot of the time those people just aren't there, because that's not the cause of it. That actually, potentially, it's the process that we've gone through. And so that then becomes quite challenging. It does pose quite an interesting scenario, which is, I think it's perfectly possible to have a process wherein every individual has done their job in good faith, to the best of their ability. Everyone's done everything they're meant to do, but the outcome of the process is still bad. And so it's potentially then very difficult to blame any of those individuals because they've done exactly what they were asked, but because the process is wrong,
Yes.
we've still got the bad outcome.
Yes. I guess in that kind of case, then what you want is to know who's accountable for the process, right? And ultimately, that's going to be the person who's held accountable for the outcome.
So absolutely. So it's about the quality of the process. So ultimately, it's the people who design and implement and take responsibility for those processes. Yeah, I think there's a good example of it that I often use to talk about testing and assurance. And I won't name the city because I'm not sure if this might be apocryphal, but it's still a really good analogy. So we use it anyway. So there's a major European city, which is a big tourist destination that has a big problem with pickpocketing. And one of the ways they seek to address that is they do a big poster campaign to make tourists aware of pickpocketing. So they go ahead and they do that, and they put the posters up. And what happens is the tourists come into the city at the central station. They all pile off the train down the main street into the big city square. They see the posters, and they immediately panic and check that they have their valuables. So they walk into the city square and immediately touch their phone or their wallet, which then means that obviously the pickpockets can just stand there and watch them and go, oh, lovely, right, I now know exactly which pocket to pick. So now the way I think of that is from a when I say testing, from a testing point of view, you would have probably looked at that in terms of testing's typically about checking, is this doing all the things it was meant to do? All the intended things there. So from a testing point of view, it probably said, is this a poster? Yeah. Has it got the right text and image on it? Yes, it has. Have they all been put up in the right place by the deadline? Yeah. Are people noticing them? Yes. You could even say, is it making people think about pickpockets? Yes, it is. So that tester would say, I have diligently done my job there. I've checked off all the things I was given that it's meant to deliver. And then the project manager looks at the test report and says, well, that's green across the board. All the boxes are ticked. So this is definitely right. Off we go. But it's still a catastrophe. It's still wrong. And so I think that's the common issue with processes is not necessarily that they do the wrong things, but that they omit things. We've got gaps in processes. So, from assurance point of view, when I talk about assurance, in that instance, assurance would have been looking at, okay, what are the things that could go wrong with this? But also, what is the point of this in the first? But ultimately, what are we trying to achieve? And is this doing that? So if you'd had an assurance step in that process, you would have potentially picked that up. So it's not necessarily that there's anything wrong, and it's not necessarily that even the process is wrong as much as the process is incomplete. And so often with things like bias, I think that's where we see that of if it's not on the radar in the first place, it's not the process isn't addressing it for good or ill. It's just not there. And so people are testing that system and saying, well, it does all the things I was told it's meant to do. So there you go. I think it's processes rather than people. So ultimately, you're right. There is still a person somewhere responsible for that process. Ultimately, but often processes are organic and a bit nebulous. They're built up over time. It's not necessarily that somebody has written down and written, "This is the process document. I'm going to own it, and everybody follow it." So it becomes really tricky then to put your finger on an individual who is ultimately responsible. And I think as well, in terms of accountability, I think it makes a lot more sense to people to say, here is an individual who did something wrong. We can get hold of that. To say, oh, well, this very complex and long-established process isn't as good as or as complete as it should be. It's a lot less interesting or exciting and just a lot less understandable, right?
I can see that. Yeah, absolutely. Okay, this is really interesting stuff. We're running out of time, but there's just one more topic really that I wanted to raise, which is the question of what level of bias, if any, is acceptable. So I think you said that, some forms of bias are acceptable, but so why is that? And can you give any examples of where bias might be acceptable?
Absolutely. So this was a really interesting piece of work that we did last year. And I think I can imagine there are some people listening for whom alarm bells are ringing. And certainly when I talked about this with colleagues at work, the idea of saying that some forms of bias are okay immediately makes people nervous, quite rightly. So we engaged with, we've got equalities experts at NHS England, so we obviously engaged with them. And we also used the Equality and Human Rights Commission's website, which has got really good guidance around interpreting the Equalities Act as well. So to start off with, we went and got a really solid foundation of subject matter experts. So the example that I tend to use to explain this would be, when we were talking earlier about training data, we were saying that it was important that all your different classes be balanced. So we'd say, for example, you want a good spread of age, for example, and gender and ethnicity and all these other things. But if we imagine an AI that is specifically being designed to look at premature babies, for example, it would actually be reasonable that you don't have older children and adults in that data. So it will perform better for the babies if it only looks at baby data. Right. It will perform better for them. And because the system is never, ever going to be used on the children or adults, they can never be harmed by being excluded because it's never going to be applied today. So that's quite a straightforward case of there is a reason there. So technically, if you were analysing that training data, you would say there's massive age bias there because everyone from 6 months up is excluded. So there's a huge age bias. But in that very specific circumstance, you would say that is appropriate. That is acceptable. Yeah.
So I think what I would be tempted to say is that that's not really bias, right? That's an appropriate focus on a particular kind of subsection of the population. And it's only bias if it's not working well for people who it's supposed to work well for, right? But I mean, maybe that's a kind of semantic point, really. Maybe in a technical sense it is bias, so is that the kind of thing that we're talking about when we talk about acceptable bias? Yeah.
You raise a really good point there. So I think it's like we said before about trying to define bias and accessibility at the beginning, or testing assurance. These words get used by a lot of different people to mean different things. Yeah. So certainly when we're talking about bias, we're specifically talking about statistical distributions in data. All right. But obviously to other audiences like yourself, it has a very different meaning because it's a much more social context, So that was a key thing that was a big part of trying to, as I say, explain to those non-technical colleagues what we were talking about. Yeah.
I suppose another example that might show an unacceptable kind of bias would be, let's say you had, I think maybe we talked about this last time briefly, but an AI system that uses video footage of people walking to diagnose Parkinson's.
Oh, yes.
Right. So if you have a system that's working like that, the likelihood that it's going to be trained with predominantly kind of older people, right? Because people who have Parkinson's tend to be older. But of course, younger people do get Parkinson's, right? So if then that system is not working as well at diagnosing people, say, in their 40s who are getting Parkinson's, then that is a problem, right? Even though you might think in terms of the training data, it's overwhelmingly likely to be older people that it's being trained on. It needs to work well for those other people as well, right? And if it's not doing that, then that's an unacceptable level of bias.
Yeah, and that's a really good example of a lot of the work that was in insurance is what refers to what we call edge cases, so the rarer things. A lot of the time in the industry, you can get away with neglecting those to a certain extent because the negative outcome is typically financial. You can offset that and manage that. In healthcare, those edge cases become a lot more important because they're typically people, like you say. So that would be a really good example of right at the beginning when you're developing that system, you need to have borne in mind that actually not all Parkinson's patients are elderly. That needs to be baked in right from the start so that it's in the training data and all the way through.
Yeah, so the question about whether it's really bias or not, or to put it another way, whether it's an acceptable or unacceptable kind of bias, is it needs to be defined relative to the uses that it's being put to, right, and the outcomes that you're looking for.
Absolutely,
right?
yes, yeah. So what we came up with for this then is 4 criteria. So as I said, this is not policy work, but it's good practice guidance within the NHS. And so we'd come up with these 4 criteria, as I say, through working with equality specialists. So it's all kind of based in the 2010 Equalities Act, and so it's slightly legalese, but so there are 4 criteria. The first one is the bias can be objectively justified as a proportionate means of achieving a legitimate aim that will, such as improving patient outcomes. So objectively justified and proportionate and legitimate are all defined in the Act. So we take the definitions from there. But what we're basically saying is you've got a good reason to do this, and this is a proportionate way of achieving a good thing. Basically, so yeah. Second one is the kind of safety net of saying the bias can be reasonably expected to do no harm. So that's the kind of safety net of saying, okay, regardless of the benefit you're getting from this, is this going to hurt anybody? And so that the example with the babies, you'd say, well, it's not going to hurt adults because we're never going to use it on adults, so it's not going to do harm. The Parkinson's example totally would, right? So yeah, absolutely. Thirdly, there's no clear alternative method without bias to achieve the same thing. So saying even if the bias is acceptable, because bias has risk associated with it, if there's a way of doing it without bias, do that, basically. And then finally, just that the bias in its context can be directly measured and continually monitored. Because that's the other thing of potentially you could have a situation where the bias is acceptable to begin with, but if the context shifts over time, perhaps now it's not. And so it's not enough to just say this is acceptable at the start and then walk away from it. We need to be continually vigilant to make sure that bias remains accepted.
And kind of continually aware that there might be a shift in the way it's being used, and that your concept of bias needs to be adjusted appropriately to the new use case. Yeah, great. Really interesting stuff. Thank you so much, Adam, for coming on again. It's been a really interesting conversation. So Adam Byfield, thanks for being on the podcast.
Lovely. Thank you so much, Jim. Pleasure.
Thanks for listening to Ethics Untangled, a podcast from IDEA, the Ethics Centre at the University of Leeds. IDEA brings ethics to life, blending in-depth theoretical inquiry with real-world experience to address the most complex ethical issues facing the world today. If you like the podcast, please leave us a rating and review. And to find out more about IDEA, including our Masters and PhD programmes and a wide range of consultancy services we offer, go to ahc.leeds.ac.uk/ethics.